Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Melanie MacEacheron. She is a lecturer in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. Her research focuses mostly on women's psychology as potential or actual mothers or allomothers and sex differences in mateships and romantic relationships. And today we're going to talk about that and also about surname changes. So, Dr. MacEacheron, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us first about what are the kinds of questions that you and your colleagues that do work in the evolutionary psychology of motherhood, I guess we could call it that, the kinds of questions you tend to explore and focus on.
So something that me and others, like Marianne Fisher, a collaborator, have focused on are competition for mates. For example, while a single mother or while a mother with a perhaps unsatisfactory partner. And this we think would be what I think would have been a common occurrence in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And I look at envy in mothers and in other women surrounding motherhood. I look at how mothers and would-be mothers help ensure they'll have enough investment and resources so their offspring will have enough and do well, do better than others. And signaling intentions about motherhood, sentiments towards mothers by children. And I've also even looked at one sort of swearing surrounding mothers.
And what are the main changes that occur when women become mothers?
So I think that that's a really good and broad question. I hadn't turned my mind to it really. There's physical changes, hormonal changes, and I'm going to, based on you asking that, I'm going to start to look into that more to see, I want to make sure that my hypotheses are sound and perhaps look at mechanisms for some of the processes that I like to look at. But basically, in terms of things like mate selection, when women become mothers, and even before they become mothers, when they're pregnant, they lose attractiveness, becoming wider around the middle. You lose that waist to hip ratio that is desired. You retain fat in those areas, and that makes you somewhat less attractive. Of course, you're older, which makes you less attractive. But women are still mothers or young mothers are still of interest as potential partners. I don't want to say that they're not. And you can look at something like so-called MILF pornography to indicate that that's the case. And of course, we know that women in traditional societies, they repartner, and when they're mothers, they still have partners and more children. But again, I don't know much about the literature from this. There isn't a lot in social psych. And that's my other areas, social psych and evolutionary psych, and there's just not a lot. So mothers are hard to study, and they're perhaps the busiest people in the world. So but I appreciate the question very much.
Yeah, but I mean, are there any major behavioral changes that we know of?
Behavioral changes that we know of.
When women become mothers?
Well, there's competition as a mother, which is not going to happen prior to becoming a mother. And really, there's not much research done in this field. I hate to say it, but there's, of course, during pregnancy, there's, and this doesn't come from social psych research, but during pregnancy, there's, more vomiting, there's avoidance of certain, potential teratogens, there's, tiredness and, this kind of thing. So I'm not sure if that answers.
So let me ask you another question then. What about allomothers? First of all, what kind of people tend to become allo mothers or help with allo parenting?
Yes, so of course this is, I think even the term allomother comes from Sarah Hrdy's seminal work on this from Mothers and Others. And so based on her work, allomothers and other people's work tend to be a partner, so someone else with a high genetic investment in the child, putative father. Usually, and grandmothers, and that's who others' work. I think Hill and Hurtado showed that the maternal grandmother's investment in the child in one society predicted, and nobody else's presence predicted, greater weight in the child. So she's making a big difference in care in terms of feeding or helping to feed the child. The thing that I'm interested in with allomothers is really more of an investment of any kind from relatives. And that work I hope to present at HBES along with Marianne Fisher and Molly Staley. We'll see. I hope we get a talk. It's work I can't tell you about yet. I'm sorry.
Okay, so let me just ask you this then. Is it the case that it's maternal grandmothers that tend to invest the more when it comes to allomothering?
Well, they're the class of grandparent that invests the most. Of course, under grandparental differential solicitude theory, they're the only class of grandparent with zero uncertainty as to grandparental or parental uncertainty, if you want to call it that, as to their genetic relatedness to the grandchild. So yes, they are the most certain investors, and this has been shown, and the greatest investors, and they as grandparents, and this has been shown in multiple ways, multiple studies. And then, of course, by contrast, the paternal grandfather has two uncertain links, uncertain genetic links to the grandchild. His own female partner may have actually been impregnated by someone other than he, so that comprises one uncertain link. And then even if that was not the case, his son, the putative father of the grandchild, his female partner may have actually been impregnated by a different male. So he's got two reasons to doubt that he's a genetic grandparent, and the two other classes of grandparent, they're moderate in their uncertainty, and investment follows that pattern. The work that I hope to present at HBES concerns, I'll just say it concerns pregnancy announcements and disclosure, and the speed at which pregnancies were disclosed followed that as well, that grandparental differential solicitude theory.
Okay, but you can tell us about that.
I don't want to get into much. I hate that that's the case, but anyway.
Okay, we will schedule another interview later in the year, and then you won't have an excuse anymore. Anyway, when I asked you my first question about what are the kinds of topics, issues that you tend to study in the evolutionary psychology of motherhood, at a certain point you mentioned envy. So in what ways does envy apply in that context?
So it's actually others who have previously published on envy, and it's and it has to do with pregnancy that I'm currently looking into envy, and I don't have again something I can report yet, but no, others have looked into competitiveness amongst mothers, showing off their children or their own beauty, sort of, I have kids and yet I still look great. Me and a collaborator wrote a little bit about that as well. So I think a good person to ask about that would be Marianne Fisher. Mm-hmm. If you interviewed her again, she could tell you, the trends in those data.
Mhm. Let me just ask you one thing. The information you've been giving us, uh, does it derive from studies focused on weird populations, or does it also include other cultures and societies?
So I haven't studied myself non-weird populations. I really think that that's very important. I've been part of like larger studies that have included, but I've collected data locally to be part of those studies. Um, but I mean, just doing lit reviews of others' work. So, for example, Hill and Hurtado, I think, collected data from a non-weird population. That's the study I was just mentioning, where they found that the maternal grandmother's contribution solely compared to other relative types was associated with increased weight in the grandchild. So others have done this, have done that research, and I was just interested in one paper that I co-wrote about. I suppose it's not people in the. I just did a lit review of I tried to focus on people living in traditional cultures without birth control and without modern medicine. I looked at a little bit about what was the percentage of relationships, sexual relationships that would actually result in a live birth, because that is definitely not certain without modern medical care. And of course, without the live birth and without the mother surviving, I also looked into that, then the child is a lot less likely to survive to adulthood. And I think that informs our psychology now. I think that was the case for most of our history, and prehistory. So yeah.
Yeah. So moving on to talking about mateships and romantic relationships, first of all, what's the difference here between the two of them?
Oh, so I was in a review paper that I wrote with Lauren Campbell. We talked about mateships because we wanted to sort of encompass different sorts of romantic and sexual relationships. So it's basically, it was any kind of a sexual relationship, so of whatever duration and other description. So a romantic relationship is not necessarily sexual. And what we were calling mateships, and I think what others call mateships, they are. So I think that's a difference.
And does it have to do anything to do with being short term or long term, or not?
Mateship is inclusive. It's short, long, same sex, opposite sex, this kind of thing. So yeah.
So, are there important sex differences when it comes to how men and women approach mateships and romantic relationships?
So I think that this sort of issue has been addressed by others, not exhaustively, in terms of sort of initial mateship formation. For example, of nulliparous women, so women have never had babies, and also relationship retention has been studied. So I'm just going to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the important sex differences in mateships and as concerned motherhood.
Okay.
So motherhood is a usual result of a mateship. Most people are heterosexual. Most, with that in our evolutionary history, there wasn't birth control, and that meant, and so that's tied up quite tightly with the mateship motherhood or fatherhood, and it meant motherhood meant years of investment and risk of death, and fatherhood did not mean risk of death, and it meant a lot less investment. The mother usually had to survive if the child was to survive to adulthood. So if you're going to have any reproductive success, mom had to survive, dad maybe didn't. Mom had risk of death, dad wouldn't. And mom's investment was huge, and dad's not necessarily was. Paternity uncertainty is another sex difference, and I think it's led to men valuing costly signals of their wives' or female partners' fidelity. I think marital surname change is such a costly signal. For example, there's evidence that women see it as a detriment to earning, and women do it less across the U.S. in states in which women earn better if income inequality is low. And I'm happy to get into that, but that's just sort of the hint of that's the case, I think. And I kind of see grandparenthood as well as really, and differences in sexes of grandparents as really tied up into mateships too, because again, usually mateships meant babies. And I can talk about differential grandparental solicitude.
Tell us first about
paternity uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us first about that earning bit you mentioned.
Yeah. So I looked at data from the Hawaii Department of Health for 2 years. Hawaii is the only U.S. state which requires brides-to-be to state whether they're going to take their husband's surname, do a combo like a hyphenate surname, or retain their own. And I related that, and I had state-level data. So from Hawaii. So they get destination brides from all over the world, including almost every U.S. state. It was only women from states which had both high female median income and low household-to-household inequality in which those women kept their surnames more than women in other states. And this indicates to me that women are aware of these income differentials. I mean, in some sense, even though in no previous literature on marital surname changes has any woman ever stated, well, that's why I'm keeping or changing my surname. But I think it's a competitive, it's a costly signal. I think it's a costly thing to do to keep your own name. It's a costly thing. It's a costly thing to do to change your surname. And I think some evidence for that is that, if women don't have to, if they feel that their own income potential is high enough and they don't have to resort to hypergamy, if income inequality is not so great, then they keep their names more. So that's part of the reason I think this is a costly signal. And I can get into the inconvenience of doing it as well, if you like.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's a cost.
Oh, and there was also an age effect, a strong age effect.
How so?
The older women getting married, the older brides-to-be, were significantly less likely, and this is from all over the world, not just the U.S. states. Mm-hmm. The older women were more likely to keep their own names. And you would maybe think that's counterintuitive, because if sort of feminism is the driver of women keeping their names, you'd think maybe younger women would be more likely to keep their names because they've lived in a society in which feminism has had influence for longer. So, but I think it has to do with, in part at least, with reproduction. So I think that's why older women, closer, they don't have to worry about as many future children and provisioning them and trying to elicit support for them from husband and family. And so they make that sacrifice of their surname less often. That's my thinking.
So just to be clear, in this case, marital surname change serves the purpose of costly signaling to their partner that what exactly? Commitment?
I think in part. I think also it's a signal that, and this has been empirically backed up, it's a signal that any children of the marriage will be surnamed for the father. Okay. And this is something that men have been have said that they want. It allows them a way, perhaps, to demonstrate paternity certainty in their children, which is perhaps helps with their prestige, and I think it would enhance the esteem of their family. There's more people being added to it, and that membership is not diluted with a sort of double surname, you know, mother and father surname, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I mean, could you just repeat, please, what are the conditions that lead to women having more marital surname changes?
Okay, so if locally for the women, in first of all, being younger, they change their surname more, and also and that's around the world, and also for U.S. women, if they're in a state in which women's median full-time income is lower,
Yeah.
and in which or in which inequality is greater, they change their surname to that of their husband more. So if there's more inequality, I'm thinking that they're trying to resort to hypergamy more. When I say resort, that's a judgmental word. They're perhaps seeking it more, and marrying up, it's sometimes called, a wealthier man, and they have to be competitive to do that. And I think you know, marital surname change is one way to do that. I'm so sorry, I forget what your question was. I think it was, what are the predictors?
Yes, exactly. The predictors
So
of surname change.
change would be women earning less locally than elsewhere in the U.S., and or there being more income inequality locally. Yes, that's. But there's other predictors that I can talk about as well. But those are from that study that I did. Those studies I did.
So tell us then about those other predictors.
Well, some unpublished work that I did showed that if a woman's, I looked at brides-to-be and undergraduate women, and if her own mom had kept her surname, then she, as a bride-to-be or as a young woman, was more likely to say that she would also. And I'm thinking that that's sort of a deviation from patrilineality. I'm thinking it's more a start of a bilineal descent reckoning. There's been other less strong, I would say, findings in the literature than I was able to find, and they're to do with things like feminist attitude, previous cohabitation, sort of a suite of traits that you or somebody might call traditionality, if you will. Yeah, religiosity, these kinds of traits.
So
So
there
more
are
traditionality, and being more right-wing in political orientation.
so there are also cultural aspects associated with this, correct?
Associated, yes, but I think it's interesting in the papers that I was just talking to you about for using the Hawaiian data. I competitively regressed each of those that I just mentioned that I was able to get state level data for. I competitively regressed it against women's local income at the state level. Women's income came significant in every regression, and the other predictor was no longer a significant predictor. So it's a stronger predictor.
So, I mean, can that tell us anything about what are the conditions that lead women to seek a more hypergamous mating strategy? Does it have anything to do with, as you mentioned, for example, income inequality?
Yeah, so with greater income inequality, there's going to be some men and some women, presumably, who are a lot wealthier than others. And So, I mean, that in itself, I think, is going to incentivize women to compete. And as I said, men have been reported, multiple studies, to like women to change their surnames at marriage. They want women to take the men's surname. I think it's going to, like I said, I think it's going to incentivize women to compete for the wealthiest men. You know, of course, they also want other traits, but that will be, in a more unequal society, you're going to do significantly better if you can attract a wealthier male mate.
I'm asking you about that because if I remember correctly, I'm not sure if these were studies done by David Buss, for example, but if I remember correctly, there was a sort of human universal, I mean, across different societies and cultures where women seem to show a preference regardless of
Yes.
earning capacity and income inequality for men that earn more than them.
Yeah, so Townsend, for example, found that even wealthy women will look for wealthier men. Absolutely. But for women who can earn adequately, the thing is, it's not just a simple choice of, okay, I'm going to take his name and I'm going to get more money for my kids and myself thereby. Because in some US states, women can earn a lot themselves. And there's a perceived earning detriment, which I feel like I should have mentioned earlier, among women surveyed by, I forget the authors. There's a perceived earnings detriment through marital surname change for women, okay? So I think women are maximizing, this is a bit of a speculation, but I think women are maximizing resources for themselves and their children, future children, through their marital surname change and achieving other goals as well.
Mm-hmm. And does marital surname change have any relationship with marital duration?
So maybe in a local county to me in Ontario, Canada, I looked at 107 divorce files, all the divorces over an 8-month period. And I found that marriages, all of which ended in divorce, of course, marriages in which the women had taken the man's surname, I only looked at opposite sex marriages. I only had time to. Those marriages lasted 60% longer, controlling for the bride's age of marriage. Okay, so it could be that, yes, they last longer. Of course, this is only marriages that eventually ended in divorce. Some of them had lasted decades, but yeah, they eventually ended in divorce. I'm thinking that it's reasonable to look at that as real, however, because about a quarter of the women in the divorce files that I looked at had kept their surname or hyphenated. Okay, so and that's high. That's probably higher than what you would expect in the Canadian population total, based on American data. So I'm thinking that amongst divorcees, that women who had changed their surname were oversampled. Okay, so I think it's real, but I can't say for sure. That's just my speculation. That yes, it does indicate that the marriage will likely last longer. However, I can't say that that's because of the brides or because of the wives, okay? Because, of course, in Canada, as elsewhere, you have unilateral divorce available. It could just be the husband who's wants to divorce, for example, or just the wife, and then a divorce will happen, okay? They both don't have to agree. So it could be that husbands are more dissatisfied with wives who don't take their surnames. And that's what's leading to lesser duration of marriage. It isn't necessarily the female's doing or fault, if you want to put it that way. Okay, it could be both sexes.
So let's say that in cases where women, cases in places where women have higher earning capacity and there's less income inequality, I mean, could it be that one of the reasons women in that particular case don't tend to adopt their husband's surname that much would be that they would be less willing to commit? I mean, would that induce in them a sort of mating strategy where they would be less long-term oriented, and so that would signal that they would want to be eventually available to mate with other men? I mean, does this make sense at all, or?
Well, I think I should probably clarify how I'm using the word commit. And
Okay.
now marriage is a commitment, even if it lasts a
Yeah,
day. I mean,
sure,
marriage is
sure.
a big deal. You have to get a license and this kind of thing. So, I mean, they're very willing to. Anyone who gets married is very willing to commit, as far as I'm thinking. But I think what you might be talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, is commitment in terms of staying together sort of despite issues, because presumably no one gets divorced for no reason,
Mm,
you know.
yeah, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, so could women who, and I think your question then is, could it be that women who can earn more, they're in areas where they can earn more and there's less income inequality, could they be less willing to stay in a suboptimal marriage?
Mhm.
I don't know if that's your question, but that's
Yes, I think that's the best way of phrasing it. Yeah.
okay. So it's possible. It's possible that they have more choices economically to support their children. So I suppose that's possible. I suppose you could also say it's possible that men in those areas might be less willing to stay in poorer marriages too. I'm now. Why might that be? Um, yeah, I don't know, but I haven't had a chance to turn my mind to it. But that's possible too. Could be both. Could be one going
Mhm.
on.
Are there situations where men also change their surnames and adopt their wife's surname in that case? I mean, situations where it's the other way around?
That is so rare that one researcher has stuck his or her neck out and said it's so rare that nobody studies it. So I don't know how you can know that without the data being out there. But Snyder put his or her neck out and said that. And so I'm going to refer to that researcher. But anyways, in my divorce study, there were 0 men who had taken the wife's surname, even occasionally. And it does appear to be quite rare. Interestingly, I have this, there's this new paper out by, uh, I'm going to try and see if I can say her name, Karthikeyan and Fisher, Marianne Fisher, in which it's shown that in a matrilineal society, the Nayars, apparently men did take, there was female surname or name transmission. So, and that's a matrilineal society. So that's the only case where I've heard of it happening to any extent. And there's just too little data to sort of, I think, to sort of say, well, the few men who do, in societies in which it's studied, the few men who do, they're doing it because of X or Y. I don't know. It could be idiosyncratic reasons.
Yeah, so we still don't have a rationale for that.
For why men might,
Mhm.
um, except based on that one NIARS example where men, I think, do. I haven't read the paper, it's brand new,
Yeah.
where men might, or at least sons, might be given the mother's name. Matrilineality might be the reason. But I have to read the paper.
Okay, fair enough. And and what about the relationship between surname change and number of children? Does that have any influence there?
Yeah, so People, writers before me were thinking that it has to do with differences in variance between reproductive success in males versus females. So the thinking there is that patrilineality is more likely where males' reproductive success is a lot more than females' reproductive success, okay? Or variance in reproductive success. So what does that mean? Variance in reproductive success for males, for example, would mean that some males are having a lot of the children and other males are having none, okay? And likewise for females, but females' reproductive success tends to be less variable anyways. But, okay, so in societies in which that's really the case with the men, some men having many children and others having none, these thinkers thinking, and I can get you their names afterwards if you like, is that patrilineality will be incentivized, and you can think of various reasons why that might be. For example, but in those societies, there's things like greater prescription against infidelity, and there's So you're talking about the relationship between marital surname change and number of children. That's not really number of children per se. That's reproductive success variance. However, in patrilineal societies, women and children are identified in some way. It doesn't have to be by surname, but they're identified in some way as belonging to their husbands, once they're married, family or group. So marital surname change is but one way that's done, but there is that relationship, and that's more sort of the anthropological literature that you could look at to look more into that if you're interested. However, I will say that in my divorce study, yes, there was a relationship whereby if a woman had taken her husband's surname at marriage, there were more children of the marriage produced. However, it wasn't it wasn't that strong a relationship. So I did a regression in which I predicted number of children of the marriage, and I used whether the woman had taken the husband's surname at marriage as a predictor, and I also used the length of the marriage as a predictor, and it only length of marriage was predicted, which is what you would think. It takes at least a year to produce each child, generally speaking. However, remember that length of marriage is predicted by whether she took his name or not.
Mm-hmm. Have you studied, for example, if it's harder for women to marry again after they've taken the surname of an ex-husband?
I have not, but I think that that's very interesting. I think it's in part a costly signal because, well, first of all, in Canada, you would have to usually ask the court. I used to practice law, and so I have some familiarity with this. You would usually have to approach the court and ask to go back to your maiden name, okay? Mm-hmm. If you were going to do that. Now, of course, traditionally, if you'd taken your husband's surname, you would be Mrs., his last name. Okay, so if you go back on the mating market and you're Mrs. X or Mrs. Y, whatever, that could be a constant reminder to potential new mates that you got this person as your ex-partner and you were married before. So I'm thinking that taking a husband's surname might be telling him, you know what? I'm going to incur a cost later on. I would incur a cost later on if I divorced you. And therefore, this is a bit even more of a costly signal, but that's my speculation. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like building a doomsday machine into your marriage. So.
Yeah, but anyway,
it's a little bit like that.
Yeah, but anyway, I was just speculating, of course, that probably potential future husbands would notice that. I mean, if their potential future wives would have taken their ex-husband's surname or not.
Absolutely. And it would be reiterated every time her name was spoken. So it would be a frequently reiterated signal.
Yeah. So that would probably be a complication, at least for her, right, in terms of mating.
Yeah, potentially. Potentially. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just ask you about one final topic. I mean, you've mentioned throughout the interview Marian Fisher, for example, and we've had this kind of discussion. But how do you look at the relationship between evolutionary psychology and feminism?
Well, I don't really know much about the topic. I wrote a paper years ago, like a popular press paper, and it concerned, and the editor made some changes to it. So, but it concerned possible common ground between the type of feminism that I'm familiar with, which is what used to be called women's liberation movement. Okay, and evolutionary psychology, and there are definite overlap areas. And my hope was that maybe someone reading it would realize that they can be both if they want, or if they can learn from each other, this kind of thing. So some of the areas, there were two areas in common, and one was that perspective taking is important in, as far as I know, in traditional feminist research anyways. And looking at different populations around the world is very important. You don't assume that people are going to be the same in their psychology necessarily, although of course you do find those universals. However, that's important in what I understand traditional feminist research to incorporate, and it's very important in evolutionary psychology. There's some evidence that this subfield of psychology is the best at looking at various cultures around the world, and not just focusing on weird ones, for example, or just the US. And another commonality between evolutionary psychology and I guess traditional feminist research is that this perspective taking extended to male and female. So you don't assume that if the other sex has a different perception than you, that they are wrong. That's kind of nonsensical in evolutionary psychology. And so there's that commonality, and you hope that people might not argue unnecessarily amongst themselves if they actually have something in common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps, I mean, maybe the more gender critical feminists, the ones that are not very fond of at least strict gender roles or biological sex differences between men and women. I guess that, I mean, on the one hand, evolutionary psychology is very much interested in uncovering the sort of universal information processing psychological mechanisms that we have, but there's also space for variability within populations, because that's also predicted by evolutionary theory. And I mean, even when we talk about behavioral sex differences, for example, we're talking about averages, right? So
yeah, and I think it's really important when you're studying something like pregnancy, like I've started to do, that you can acknowledge that there may be average sex differences. I mean, this is sort of an obvious case where if we're going to serve all people, then we have to be able to acknowledge that there could be differences, right? Otherwise, we're not going to study those areas.
Yeah. I mean, with my previous comment, I was just perhaps highlighting the fact that feminists don't have to be against evolutionary psychology if they think that men can be a little bit more feminine or women can be a little bit more masculine, because that's also natural to occur, right?
It's, yeah, there's no necessary tension, or there's no necessary taking one camp versus another. It's not like that.
Yeah. Okay, so where can people find your work on the internet?
So I have, I guess, a site on ResearchGate where I put up all my or a web page on ResearchGate, and of course you can just Google my surname because it's pretty unique. Its spelling is unique. So
Yeah,
go to Google Scholar and type in my surname.
yeah, okay. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been really fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Take care, and I hope we can talk soon.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Lononho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.